The first time he saw her scars. He didn't flinch, he looked away. Not out of disgust, but out of reverence. That night, their wedding night, the wind from the Atlantic rattled the old windows, and two strangers sat 6 feet apart, learning the language of silence. She wrapped herself in ritual folding, straightening, pretending she wasn't trembling. He laid a blanket at the foot of the bed and said softly, "Nothing happens unless you ask." She had been taught that love demanded surrender. He would teach her that love could mean permission. This is the story of how two wounded souls built a home from honesty, how a woman once broken by faith found it again, not in prayer, but in gentleness. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. The storm had followed them home from the reception. Wind dragged across the eaves like restless fingers, and the old house, Grant Whitaker's house, groaned as if it remembered too much. The ocean roared somewhere beyond the black windows, carrying the faint clang of a buoy bell. Nora stood in the middle of the master suite, her veil already folded, her satin jacket draped carefully across a cedar chest. The scent of salt and roses clung to her skin. She kept her hands busy straightening the quilt, aligning the edges of the pillow, because stillness was dangerous. Stillness made space for memory. The mirror caught her face in the half-light. A woman of 38, polite smile trained from years of endurance, eyes shadowed by sleepless months. The gown fit perfectly, too perfectly, a costume she could not breathe in. Downstairs, the last car doors closed. Guests were gone. The laughter, the congratulations, the clinking glasses all swept out to sea. Only the sound of rain tapping against the tall windows remained. Nora unpinned her hair. Chestnut waves fell over her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind. She counted her breaths 1, 2, 3, then exhaled into the quiet. A knock, soft and deliberate 3 taps. Her spine stiffened. For an instant, she was somewhere else, another house, another night. A voice shouting her name. She blinked it away. "Come in," she managed. Grant stepped inside, still wearing his vest and tie loosened at the collar. The lamplight caught the streaks of gray at his temples. He carried 2 mugs and a folded wool blanket draped over one arm. His footsteps stopped just inside the doorway. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "I made tea. Chamomile." She nodded, unsure what to do with her hands. "Thank you." He set one mug on the nightstand, the other on the dresser, and placed the blanket neatly at the foot of the bed. Then, without another word, he stepped back exactly 6 feet. The space between them felt intentional, protective. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm filled the silence for them. "I'm aware this house can be intimidating," Grant said quietly. "It's been empty a long time." "So have I," Nora replied before she could stop herself. The words hung between them like fragile glass. Grant's gaze lifted, searching her expression, but he didn't move closer. He only nodded, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a truth too personal to question. He gestured toward the hallway. "I'll be down the corridor if you need anything. Nothing happens here unless you ask. Nora, ever?" Something in his tone, calm, unflinching, made her chest tighten. People had said kind things to her before, but kindness with boundaries felt different, safer. She wanted to believe him. When he turned to go, she caught a glimpse of his hand open at his side, visible, the gesture of a man who had learned the cost of unexpected touch. He paused at the threshold, listening to the wind whip around the corners of the house. "Good night, Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly. The title jarred her. It belonged to another life, another woman. She almost corrected him, but found no strength to speak. After he left, the door stayed ajar. His rule. She realized an open door, open air, nothing hidden. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, the satin fabric rustling under her fingers. She lifted the teacup, watched the steam twist and vanish. Every small sound, the crackle of the fireplace downstairs, the ticking of an unseen clock seemed louder in his absence. She tried to steady her breathing. The storm outside matched the one within, waves colliding against walls built years ago. She thought about Grant's eyes, steady, unafraid of silence. He wasn't like the man before. At least, she hoped not. Her robe slipped slightly as she reached for the blanket. Cool air touched her shoulder. Fabric fell away. For a second, she forgot to pull it back. And then she saw his reflection in the mirror. He had returned silently, holding a tray she hadn't noticed: sugar, honey, a small plate of shortbread cookies. He stopped when he saw her uncovered skin. The scars, faint and pale, curved across her shoulder like old rivers drying in sunlight. Grant's expression changed, not shock, not pity, only stillness. Respectful, painful stillness. He lowered his gaze to the floor. "I forgot the sugar," he said quietly. His voice barely rose above the rain. "I'll leave it here." She turned toward him, instinctively tugging the robe closed. The sound of fabric tightening was the only answer she gave. Grant set the tray on the dresser, then looked toward the window, giving her privacy. The room smelled of tea and wet cedar. "I'm here if you need a friend," he said finally. No sermon, no question, just that. Then he stepped back into the hall, leaving the door wide open behind him. The house exhaled. Nora stood motionless, watching the outline of his shadow disappear along the corridor. The wind caught the half-open curtains, making them billow like sails. For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of warmth, not from the fire, but from the small mercy of a man who knew when not to touch. Outside, the sea kept roaring. Inside, she listened to her heartbeat until it matched the rhythm of the storm, uneven, alive, waiting for something she couldn't yet name. Morning came soft and gray, the kind of coastal dawn where the fog rolls off the water like breath. The house smelled faintly of coffee and sea salt. Downstairs, Nora heard the kettle whistle and the low creak of old floorboards expanding with the day's first light. She hesitated at the top of the stairs. The night had been long. She hadn't slept, not fully, her body still tense, as if waiting for something that never came. But nothing had. The door had stayed open. No footsteps, no intrusion, just wind and the distant hum of the ocean. That was new. Safety felt foreign, like shoes that didn't yet fit. When she reached the kitchen, Grant was already there, sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee into 2 thick white mugs. He looked up briefly. "Good morning," he said, voice calm, steady. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, so I made it 3 ways black, with cream and with honey." She blinked, almost smiling despite herself. "That's generous." He shrugged lightly. "Trial and error. I like rules that come from experience." He picked up both mugs and gestured toward the side porch. "It's clearer outside, easier to breathe when you can see the horizon." They stepped out together. The porch faced east, the wooden planks damp beneath their bare feet. The tide was out. Gulls wheeled over the dark sand. The air smelled of salt and cedar. Grant placed the mugs on the railing, then pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket and set it on the table between them. The paper had faint coffee stains and curled edges. "I'd like to make something clear," he began. "Last night, our first night, wasn't a misunderstanding. I meant what I said. Nothing happens here without your voice." Nora's shoulders tensed, instinctively bracing for correction, but his tone stayed even. He opened the notebook and, with a carpenter's pencil, began to write slowly. "I've learned that when you rebuild something that's been damaged, you start with rules, not feelings. Feelings come later. When the foundation holds." He wrote a number, 1. The graphite scratched softly. "Rule 1, he said aloud. "Knock and wait." Nora watched, silent. He wrote again. "Rule 2, no entering rooms without permission." Her eyes drifted toward the doorframe. "Even if it's your own house, especially then." Something in her chest loosened. Grant's handwriting was deliberate, almost architectural. He wrote the next line without looking up. "Rule 3, Speak truth about fear. That one made her pulse skip. She wasn't sure she could. Truth about fear wasn't polite. It was messy. But he kept going. Rule 4, he said softly. Consent always, in everything. He set the pencil down and slid the notebook toward her. It's not a contract. It's an agreement of peace. But peace works better when both sides write it. She glanced down at the page. 4 neat lines. His penmanship careful, slanted slightly left. She traced the edge of the paper with her fingertip. And what happens if one of us breaks the rules, she asked. He leaned back in his chair. Then we talk. Talking counts as rebuilding. She studied him for a moment, the weathered hands, the way he looked toward the sea instead of at her, as if giving her room to decide who she wanted to be in his presence. Finally, she took the pencil and, beneath his 4 lines, added a 5th. No lies about the past when asked. Grant read it slowly, nodded once. That's fair. It's necessary, she said quietly. People build trust out of truth, not silence. He tore the page neatly from the notebook, folded it in half, and reached for his pen. Sign it. Nora hesitated, then printed her name in small, deliberate letters. Grant did the same beneath hers. When he finished, he folded the paper once more and tucked it into his shirt pocket, pressing his hand briefly over it, right above his heart, for safekeeping. He said. The fog began to lift, revealing a stripe of pale blue sky. Nora wrapped her hands around the warm mug. She wanted to thank him, but words felt too fragile. Instead, she said, You take things slow. He smiled faintly. I build boats, Nora. Slow keeps them from sinking. The smallest laugh escaped her, a quick, startled sound, half disbelief, half relief. It had been months since laughter had felt safe in her mouth. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while. The waves came and went, rhythmic and sure. Grant refilled her coffee without asking. She let him. Then she decided to test the rules. Maybe not out of mistrust, but curiosity, the cautious kind that comes after too many broken promises. If I say stop, she said suddenly, you stop. Grant turned his head toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time that morning. There was no hesitation, no argument. Even if the house is on fire, he replied. His answer landed like a stone in still water, rippling through every unspoken fear she'd carried. She studied his face, searching for irony or pity, but found neither, only sincerity, quiet and heavy. She looked away quickly, toward the sea where the light was sharpening. Inside, the grandfather clock chimed 8. Somewhere in the yard, a gull shrieked. Nora felt something unfamiliar settle inside her, a tentative warmth that wasn't yet comfort, but close. She didn't smile fully, but the corners of her mouth tilted, almost there. Grant noticed. He didn't comment. He simply reached for his mug and said, "To new rules." Then she raised hers slightly. "To peace," she murmured. For a long time, they sat in silence, the fog dissolving around them, the paper tucked against his chest fluttering slightly with each breath he took. When Nora finally rose to go back inside, the sun had climbed higher, brushing gold across the porch rail. She paused at the door and looked back. Grant was still sitting there, coffee cooling beside him, gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time since the wedding began, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt chosen. The wind picked up just after sunset. It came first as a restless murmur through the pines, then a low roar that rolled inland from the sea. By the time the first thunder cracked, the lamps in the Whitaker house had already begun to flicker. Grant stood at the kitchen window, watching the horizon disappear behind a curtain of rain. "That's coming fast," he muttered, reaching for the old flashlight that hung by a leather strap near the door. Nora appeared behind him, a wool shawl over her shoulders. "How bad will it get?" "Bad enough," he said. "When the power goes, we move to the lighthouse. The generator there still works." Outside, the sky rumbled again, long and deep. The first flash of lightning lit the porch in silver. Nora flinched at the sound. Instinctively clutching the shawl tighter, Grant noticed but said nothing. He packed 2 flashlights, a wool throw, and a thermos of hot water into a canvas bag. When he opened the front door, the storm hit them full force salt wind and needles of rain. He held the door with his shoulder and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, but not controlling. The hand of a man guiding, not leading. They ran the short path down to the lighthouse, the beam above them sweeping faint arcs through the mist. By the time they reached the heavy wooden door, both were soaked to the skin. Grant shoved it open, and they stepped into the hollow echo of the round stone chamber. The air inside smelled of rust and damp rope. He set the bag down, turned the flashlight upward, and the walls glimmered faintly, slick with moisture. "Still standing," he said, almost to himself. Nora shook rain from her hair, water dripping down the ends. "How old is it?" "Built in 1904. Grant answered. "My grandfather worked maintenance here. I used to climb those stairs as a kid, thought I could see the edge of the world from the top. A flash of lightning split the sky again, and the narrow windows filled with white light. The thunder followed, louder this time, rolling through the stones." Nora hugged the shawl close. "I've never liked storms," she admitted quietly. "They remind me of doors slamming." Grant nodded, flicked on the second flashlight, and handed it to her. "Then we'll keep the light steady," he said. They settled on an old bench by the window. He poured hot water from the thermos into 2 tin cups and handed her one. For a while, they listened to the rain hammering the roof, the rhythm constant, unrelenting. "Storms don't bother you?" she asked. "They used to," he said. "Not anymore. The sea takes what it wants. Fighting it only makes you tired." Something about the sentence lingered, part resignation, part understanding. Nora looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You sound like someone who's lost before." Grant let out a short, dry laugh. My wife, Margaret, 5 years ago, ovarian cancer." His eyes stayed fixed on the dark window. "I kept working through it, ran the shipyard, signed papers, built things. It was easier to measure wood than emotions." "Efficient," he said, the word like a confession. "Not present." Nora waited before answering. "Grief makes us practical. It's how we survive." He glanced at her then, the lamplight catching the wet strands of hair clinging to her cheek. "What about you? You left your last town overnight, didn't you?" Her breath caught. "You checked." He shook his head. "I didn't need to. You pack like someone used to leaving fast." She looked down, tracing the rim of her cup. "I did leave. No forwarding address, no note. I told myself it was freedom, but it felt like exile. Sometimes they're the same thing," he said. A silence settled between them, not heavy, but full of things unspoken. The storm outside softened to a steady hiss of rain against glass. Somewhere far off, a foghorn moaned. Grant leaned back against the cool wall, stretching his legs out before him. "When the lights went out earlier, you didn't panic?" he said quietly. "Most people do." "I've been through worse darkness," she answered simply. He didn't press further. He just nodded once, slow, respectful. Lightning flashed again, and for an instant their faces were lit starkly his, marked by years of weather and loss. Hers pale, calm, carrying the kind of beauty that comes from endurance. "You know," he said after a long pause, "when Margaret got sick, she told me something I didn't understand until recently. What was it that sometimes love is just showing up and shutting up?" Nora smiled faintly. "I think she was right." Another crack of thunder shook the windows, followed by the long metallic wail of a siren from down the hill, the shipyard alarm. Grant straightened. "That's not a drill." He pulled on his jacket and grabbed his flashlight. "Probably a loose rig or power line. I need to check." Nora rose too. "You can't go out in that." "I have to," he said, already pulling on his boots. "The storm's rough. Men might still be working." She looked at him, caught between fear and admiration. "Then take this." She wrapped the wool throw around his shoulders. He smiled, despite the tension. "You'll freeze without it. I'll manage." He hesitated, then slipped off his heavy coat and handed it to her. "Trade," he said. The coat smelled of cedar and machine oil, a scent both sharp and grounding. She held it to her chest, the warmth of his body still inside it. Grant turned toward the door. "Stay inside. Lock it behind me." She nodded. "Be careful." He opened the door, and the wind swallowed his figure in a wash of rain. For a moment she could still see the beam of his flashlight moving through the fog. Then nothing. Only the rhythmic pulse of the beacon above and the echo of waves colliding against stone. Nora sat back on the bench, his coat draped around her shoulders. The scent clung cedar, salt, faint smoke. It filled the room, filled her lungs, steadied her. She stared out at the darkness where he'd gone, listening for the next siren, the next sign of life, wondering when she had last cared if someone made it home. The rain had finally passed, leaving the streets slick and shining under the early evening light. The church parking lot was already half full when Grant turned the truck off and looked over at Nora. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked. She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, pulling it past her wrist. "It's just a potluck, right? How dangerous can potato salad be?" He smiled at that, an easy, genuine smile she hadn't seen before. "In Maine, depends who made it." The laughter that slipped out of her caught her by surprise. She wasn't ready for this whirled paper plates, folding chairs, the smell of coffee, but Grant had said it would be good to meet people, to be seen as more than the quiet woman in the old Whitaker house. The basement smelled like brewed coffee and lemon cleaner. Strings of white bulbs looped along the low ceiling, giving the place a soft, homemade glow. Children darted between tables. Someone was talking loudly about the Red Sox game on a small TV in the corner. Grant balanced a plate loaded with baked beans, rolls, and something green that might have been salad. He nodded toward an open spot at the far table. There. Less traffic. Nora followed, keeping her hands folded around her paper plate. Every instinct told her to observe first, to stay small. Grant, though, seemed at ease here, greeting people with quiet nods, shaking hands, answering questions about the shipyard repairs after the storm. At the table, a woman with a neat gray bob and sharp blue eyes introduced herself. "Marjorie Cole," she said, offering a hand. Retired teacher, professional pie baker, occasional troublemaker. Nora shook her hand lightly. "Nora, Grant's better half, I presume," Marjorie said with a wink. Nora felt her throat tighten. Before she could find words, Grant's calm voice came from behind her. "She's her own half," he said lightly, setting down his plate. "But we share coffee privileges." Marjorie chuckled. Good answer. The ice broke a little. They ate. People told stories about power outages, lost umbrellas, and the mysterious disappearance of Pastor Jim's lawn chair during the last hurricane. Someone passed around brownies. The air was full of laughter and the scrape of plastic forks on paper plates. For a moment, Nora allowed herself to breathe. This, she thought, might be what ordinary life felt like, the simple background noise of community. Then it happened. A woman at the next table reached over to pass her a basket of rolls. Her fingers brushed Nora's wrist, just skin on skin, casual, nothing meant by it. But Nora flinched before she could stop herself. The sound of her fork clattering against the plate drew eyes. Grant's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Give her space, please," he said gently, not sharp or protective, just kind. "It's been a long week." The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's fine," Nora said quickly, forcing a small smile. "I just startle easily." Marjorie, sitting across from her, said nothing, but her gaze softened, the kind of look that said she saw more than she'd ever mention aloud. She reached into her tote bag and slid a folded flyer onto the table, close enough for Nora to notice, but far enough that she could ignore it if she wanted. Women's Support Circle, Wednesdays, 6 p.m., all stories, welcome. Nora's eyes lingered on the line, all stories welcome, before she tucked the paper discreetly under her napkin. The evening moved on. The TV announcer's voice murmured about baseball. Someone passed around a guitar and sang an off-key hymn. Grant chatted with a group of older men about the shipyard, laughing softly at their tall tales. When it was over, he carried both their plates to the trash and nodded toward the door, ready to make our escape. She smiled, grateful. Lead the way. Outside, the air had cooled. The church's backyard was strung with yellow bulbs that swayed gently in the breeze. The grass was still damp, and the scent of lilac drifted from the hedge by the fence. They walked side by side, saying little. Music drifted faintly from inside, someone playing piano as they cleaned up. The night hummed with crickets. "You handled that well," he said finally. "The flinching?" she asked. "The whole evening?" She exhaled, letting the damp air steady her. "I kept waiting for someone to ask who I really am. People here care more about how you take your coffee than where you came from," he said. "You'll see." They stopped beneath a strand of lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The bulbs cast a golden halo around them, soft and imperfect. "Marjorie seems nice," Nora said. "She's a good soul," Grant agreed. "Taught half the town how to read, the other half how to mind their manners." "She noticed," Nora said, glancing down at her long sleeves. "She notices everything," he said, "but she doesn't talk unless someone asks." Nora hesitated, looking toward the church windows. "Do they all know who you are? In this town?" He smiled. "Everyone knows everyone's stories. We just pretend not to." The light caught the edge of his profile, lined, weathered, kind. There was something deeply reassuring in the way he stood grounded, unhurried, like someone who had learned to let moments breathe. He turned to her, more serious now. "Nora, I need to ask something." She braced slightly. "All right. When people here ask about us, do you want me to introduce you as Mrs. Whitaker?" The question hung in the air, simple but enormous. Her fingers tightened around the folded flyer in her pocket. "I don't know," she admitted. "It doesn't feel like my name yet." He nodded once. "Then we'll wait. For tonight, just Nora." She looked up at him. "Just Nora," she repeated softly. The wind tugged at the hem of her sleeve. The church door creaked open behind them, spilling warm light and laughter into the night. Grant reached for the truck keys in his pocket, but didn't move to open the door yet. "Instead," he said, "you did good tonight." "Did I better than you think?" She turned her face toward the sound of the sea beyond the hill, breathing in the mix of lilac and salt. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. Just visible enough. The string lights swayed above them, and in that gentle glow, her name only Nora felt like a beginning. The afternoon light was thin and sharp, the kind that makes dust look like snow. Grant had the mudroom door propped open with a brick. Salt air drifted in, cutting through the smell of oil and pine cleaner. A row of wet boots lined the wall. Above them, a pegboard held tools that gleamed with stubborn honesty. He was returning a set of wrenches to the 8-foot workbench, laying each piece back in its place, when Nora stepped in from the yard. She wore a summer dress the color of robin's eggs, a rare splash of brightness against the muted house. Her hair was pinned loosely. She moved carefully, as if the room were a lake with thin ice. "Marjorie sent blueberries," she said, holding up a basket. "Said you'd trade a pie for fixing her porch rail." "Fair deal," he answered, sliding the socket set into its slot. "I'll make the call." She smiled, quick and small, and reached for the hook where her cardigan hung. A nail head, bent slightly outward, waited at the edge of the frame like a trap. The snag was soft at first, a hush of fabric catching, then a sound like breath tearing in two. Nora stopped. The dress pulled taut, pinned to the door jamb by that crooked nail. A seam gave way with a faint, betraying rip. Grant turned at the noise. Her eyes had already gone wide. One hand flew to her shoulder. The torn fabric slackened and fell, bearing a pale crescent of skin, and the scars. Not the faint, accidental kind. These were deliberate, raised, old roads across tender ground. Nora didn't move. She was stone with breathing. Grant did the only thing he knew would not break anything. He looked away, not at her, not at the wounds. He looked at the floor, then at the window, at the patient rectangle of sky. He shrugged out of his denim overshirt, slow, steady, and held it out toward her without turning his head. "It's clean," he said, voice level, left pockets torn. "Ignore that." She took it with shaking fingers. The fabric was sun-worn, soft. She pulled it around herself, swallowed by the weight and the scent. Cedar. Soap. A life that didn't shout. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For a nail that should have been hammered flush. He set the last wrench down with care. That's on me." She was still standing in the doorway, half in sunlight, half in shadow, as if the room hadn't decided whether to keep her. He reached for the hammer, drove the nail back into obedience with 2 quiet taps, then hung the cardigan neatly where it wouldn't catch again. His hands worked because his chest could not. There was a drumbeat under his ribs he didn't trust. He put the hammer down, turned finally, met her eyes, only her eyes. "May I fix the seam?" he asked. "Or should I leave you the kit? I can do it," she said, voice small but intact. "Threads in the tin by the window." She nodded and crossed the room. The overshirt swallowed her to the wrists, but her hands were steady when she found the tin, needle, thread, breathing. Each thing a step back from a cliff she'd been shoved over before. Grant stayed by the bench, palms pressed flat to the edge. He made himself count bolts in the shadow of the vise. 1, 2, 3, anything to give her space. Silence held the room the way a cupped hand holds water. She threaded the needle on the first try. He pretended not to notice. She stitched in small, precise bites, the kind that don't pucker. The blue fabric came back together like a wound deciding to close. The overshirt slipped at her collar as she bent. Her fingers paused. He looked back out the door to the sea, a slice of iron blue beyond the grass. When she finished, she tied off the thread and cut it clean. "May I ask," he said, voice even as he could make it, to replace the nail with a proper hook. Later. "You won't catch again." "Please," she said. He nodded. The motion sent something inside him into place, one small piece of order among many broken things. He risked one more step, not toward her body, toward the truth they'd already agreed to speak. "Who did this?" he asked. Not a roar, not a whisper. A question set carefully on the table between them. Nora didn't look up right away. She ran her thumb along the new seam as if testing the strength. When she spoke, the words were smooth with use, the way a prayer gets from saying it too often. Someone who prayed before he hurt. Grant's jaw tightened. The muscles there jumped once, then held. He let the anger come and stand beside him, not inside him. He had known men like that. Smooth voices, hard hands. Men who use God's name like a glove to keep their own clean. He felt the urge to move, to fix, to find a hammer big enough for the world. He did none of it. He did not lunge, didn't ask for dates or proof, didn't make her carry the weight of his fury on top of her own. He straightened, met her eyes again, kept his voice level, because rage without aim is just noise. "It won't happen again," he said, "not while I breathe." Something in her face shifted, not relief exactly, but the recognition of a line drawn, a perimeter set by someone who knew how to build things that didn't fall. The house settled around them with a small wooden sigh. Outside, a gull barked once and went quiet. Nora set the needle in the pincushion, the tin lid clicking softly shut. She looked at the doorway where the nail had been, and at the bench where his hands rested like anchors. "People say that," she murmured. "Lots of people say that." "I know." He didn't defend himself. "So, I'll do it instead." "How?" "By listening first." He gestured to the door, the hall, the wide plain of the day beyond. "By not touching until asked, by making sure every door in this house opens from your side." He paused, "and by not letting him, or anyone who sounds like him, near your life again." Her breath trembled once. The overshirt collar brushed her jaw, and she held it in place like a borrowed shield. "Do you want me to call anyone?" he asked. A lawyer? A friend? Marjorie? Nora shook her head. Not yet. All right. He cleaned the bench with a rag that had known 100 small repairs. The rhythm steadied him. The work said things can be mended, not erased. Mended. She folded the torn corner of the dress under and pressed the seam flat with her thumb. A quiet benediction for fabric and for herself. I'll make the pie, she said at last, as if the sentence could knit the day back together. Blueberry? Too much sugar, he said, grateful for the ordinary argument. Marjorie's porch rail will collapse from envy. A ghost of a smile. You can lecture me about structural integrity after you eat. Deal? She moved toward the door. He stepped aside, giving her the full width of the frame. As she passed, the scent of cedar lifted again from the denim, the faintest promise of warmth that didn't burn. She paused there, one hand on the jamb where the nail used to be. Her fingers traced the smooth wood, then dropped. She didn't look back. Grant watched the space she left behind, felt the shape of his vow settle into the room like a beam set true. Outside, the tide had turned. He could hear it in the pull of water on stone. He picked up the hammer again, not because there was anything left to fix in the mudroom, but because building something sound seemed like the only honest reply. The house, listening, held its breath. The morning began like any other, with sunlight finding its way through the lace curtains in faint, shy beams. The kettle hissed on the stove, and Grant was sanding the edge of a cabinet door he planned to refit in the pantry. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and toast. Ordinary. Peaceful until Nora's phone rang. The sound startled her. She had left the phone on the counter, screen up. When she turned, the name burned in blue light. Pastor Eldon Ward. The mug in her hand trembled. She set it down too fast. Coffee sloshed onto the table. Grant looked up immediately, catching not the name, but the silence that followed. He didn't move closer, didn't even straighten fully. His voice came quiet and level. Porch or kitchen? Her throat tightened. Porch, she managed. He nodded once, wiped his hands on a cloth, and led the way to the back porch. Morning mist still hung over the fields beyond the fence. He opened the screen door, stepped aside to let her pass first, and waited until she sat on the bench before taking the chair across from her, close enough to listen, far enough to breathe. The phone still buzzed on the table between them, persistent, almost alive. When it finally stopped, the silence that replaced it was worse. Nora pressed the screen until it went black. He found my number, she whispered. Grant kept his gaze on the field. Same man. She nodded. My mother's second husband. The one I told you I left behind. The wind stirred the hem of her sleeve. He said nothing, just reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded handkerchief, placing it between them. She didn't cry, but the gesture steadied her anyway. I thought he was gone. She said, the church said he retired, but someone must have told him where I moved. Maybe he saw an article about the shipyard and recognized the name Whitaker. Grant's brow furrowed slightly. You think he's trying to contact you, or control you? Nora gave a small, humorless laugh. With him, they're the same thing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. Do you want me to block the number? No? She hesitated. Not yet. If he calls again, I want to know what he says. I just don't want him to hear me afraid. Grant nodded, accepting the decision as final. Then we wait. The air between them felt fragile, a pane of glass balanced on truth. Nora looked out over the grass that sloped down toward the road. When I left, she said after a long pause, it wasn't brave. I didn't pack carefully, didn't plan. I ran. Running counts, he said. It means you still had something left worth saving. She met his eyes then, surprised by the simplicity of it. For once, there was no sermon waiting behind someone's kindness. The phone buzzed again, a low vibration against the wood of the table. Her name flashed once more, Eldon Ward. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. She let it ring until it stopped. When the silence came back, it was full of ghosts. Grant reached for the pad of index cards he always kept in his pocket, scraps for measurements, phone numbers, small notes of things that mattered. He tore one off, pulled a pencil from behind his ear, and waited. "Say it," he said softly. She looked at the card. "Say what? The name? Let me write it down. That way it's not loose in the air." Nora swallowed. The name had always lived like a splinter under her skin. Saying it aloud felt like pushing it through. "Eldon Ward," she whispered. Grant wrote it carefully, the letters steady, each one spaced with precision. Then he set the pencil down and studied the small rectangle of paper. "What do you want me to do with it?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Then we won't decide today." He rose, walked inside, and returned a moment later with the small safe box from his desk, a sturdy metal one with a key taped to the bottom. He opened it, slid the card inside, and closed the lid with a quiet click. Then he set it on the table between them. "We'll keep it here," he said. "Not gone, just contained. We'll decide what to do with it when you're ready." She stared at the box, its dull surface catching bits of sunlight. "You're not going to look him up. No, not even to see what he's doing." Now Grant's eyes held hers. "If I did that, I'd make him bigger than your choice to leave. He doesn't deserve that." Something inside her loosened, like a knot finely untied. "Most people would have searched by now," she said quietly. "I'm not most people," he replied, "and he's not my story to chase." The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of wet grass and sawdust. For the first time since the call, she breathed fully. They sat like that for a while, saying nothing. The world around them seemed to resume its gentle rhythm, the caw of a crow, the creak of the porch boards, the distant hum of a passing truck. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller. "I used to think if I never said his name, he'd fade. That silence was protection." "Maybe it was," Grant said. "Back then. Silence keeps you alive. But saying it now, that's not weakness. It's proof you made it out." She looked at him, eyes searching. "You really believe people can start over?" "I've seen wood rot clean through and still hold when you brace it right," he said. "Why not people?" Her lips curved faintly, halfway between disbelief and relief. "You make everything sound like a boat." He smiled. "Boats float. It's not the worst metaphor." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter that doesn't erase pain, but makes room beside it. When the phone buzzed again later that morning, Nora didn't jump. She just watched it light up once, then go dark. The safe on the table remained closed, the name locked away. Grant stood to go back inside. "I'll be in the shop if you need to talk." "Thank you," she said. He paused in the doorway. "For what?" "For letting me say it out loud." He nodded. That's how things lose their power. After he left, Nora sat for a long time on the porch, the mist lifting slowly from the fields. The sound of the ocean drifted faintly up the hill, steady, endless, alive. She picked up the phone, looked at the black screen, then set it face down on the table. The safe gleamed faintly in the morning light. She touched it once, lightly, then folded her hands in her lap. The day felt cleaner somehow, as if air had finally moved through a room long closed. Inside, the kettle began to whistle again. Nora rose, barefoot on the porch planks, following the sound back into the house where warmth waited. The shipyard hummed like a living thing metal, wind, the low thrum of engines echoing off the corrugated walls. It was late morning, and the air smelled of diesel and salt. Gulls circled overhead, bold as thieves. Grant stood by the open bay door, sleeves rolled, clipboard tucked under his arm. He was checking the new shipment of rigging when he noticed Nora hesitating by the truck. She wore jeans and a faded gray sweater, her hair tied back, her posture uncertain. "Ready," he called out. She nodded. "You sure they won't mind me here?" "They'll mind if you don't show up," he said with a small grin. "Half the crew's been trying to guess what you do for a living. I'd rather they learn than invent." She followed him inside, eyes darting over the enormous space steel ribs of half-built boats, the clang of tools, men shouting measurements across the yard, the smell of salt water mixed with warm oil and wood dust. It was a world that worked with its hands and spoke in action. Grant led her to the back office where a small first aid station stood just a cot, a sink, and a steel cabinet labeled Clinic. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's what we've got. I'd like you to help me stock it right." "You trust me with that?" she asked. "I trust you more than the guys who think whiskey disinfects everything." She smiled, small and fleeting, then rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what we have." For the next hour, she worked methodically organizing bandages, checking expiration dates, stacking antiseptic and gauze in neat rows. Her movements were calm, deliberate, professional. By the time she finished, the place looked less like a corner of a workshop and more like a small, working infirmary. "You've done this before," Grant observed. "I was a hospice nurse for almost 10 years, she said, without looking up. "It teaches you to pay attention. Pain doesn't lie." Before he could reply, a shout came from outside. "Boss, we need a hand." Grant was already moving. Nora followed instinctively. Near the dock, a young deckhand sat on a crate, blood dripping from his palm into the dirt. "Cut it on the metal edge," the man said, grimacing. "Just a scratch." "It's more than a scratch," Nora said, crouching beside him. The gash was clean but deep, about 2 inches, bleeding steadily. She grabbed a towel from a nearby toolbox and wrapped it firm, applying pressure. "Hold this tight." The men around them watched. She didn't flinch at the sight of blood, didn't hesitate or bark orders. She worked quickly, quietly, with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. "Grant, I need clean water," she said. He handed her a bottle without question. "Good. Now, hold his arm steady." When she peeled the towel back, the bleeding had slowed. She cleaned the wound, dabbed it dry, and sealed it with butterfly strips from the first aid kit she'd insisted on restocking that morning. "There," she said softly. "You'll live to brag about it." The young man flexed his hand, surprised. "Feels better already. Keep it dry for a few days. And no heavy lifting until it scabs." He nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am." As she stood, she caught the change around her. The men's expressions had shifted from curiosity to respect. It wasn't the kind of attention that burns. It was the kind that steadies. Grant met her eyes across the yard. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. His look said more, "You belong here." Someone started up a saw again, and the rhythm of the shipyard returned. Nora exhaled slowly, the faintest tremor of pride in her chest. But then, as she packed up the supplies, a voice rose from the far side of the dock. "Guess we've got ourselves a Florence Nightingale," one of the foremen called out, grinning too broadly. "Careful, fellas. She might charge by the hour." Laughter rippled through a few of the younger men, half nervous, half thoughtless. Grant's head turned sharply. He walked over, calm but deliberate. His boots hit the wood in even beats. When he stopped beside the man, he didn't raise his voice. "Careful, Ted," he said evenly. "That woman you're talking about just saved your crewman's hand. She's not the entertainment." The foreman chuckled awkwardly. "Come on, boss. Just a joke." Grant's tone stayed quiet, unflinching. "Then here's mine. Nora runs our hearts steady. Show respect." The yard went still. The foreman looked from Grant to Nora and back again. A flush rose up his neck. "You're right," he said finally. Then he turned to her. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Nora met his gaze without anger. "Apology accepted," she said simply. He nodded, awkward but sincere, and the men scattered back to work. The saws started again. The clang of hammers resumed, and the air filled once more with ordinary noise, the sound of a place that knew how to move forward. Grant turned to her. "You okay?" She nodded, brushing her hands on her jeans. "You didn't have to, I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "But I wanted to." They walked back toward the small clinic. The young deckhand called after her. "Thanks again. Miss Nora?" She paused mid-step. "Miss Nora, not Mrs. Whitaker, not the boss's wife, just Nora." And somehow, that title fit better than any she'd worn in years. Back at the workbench, Grant leaned against the counter, watching her refill the kit. "They'll remember today," he said, "not because you patched someone up, because you showed them what steady looks like." She gave a small, tired smile. "Steady's easier when someone keeps the ground level." He chuckled softly. "I'll handle the ground. You keep the pulse." She glanced toward the open bay doors where sunlight streamed across the floor, turning the sawdust to gold. "I didn't think I'd ever work again," she admitted, "or that I'd want to." Grant didn't answer right away. He just picked up a rag, wiped a spot of oil from the counter, and said, "Purpose doesn't leave. It just waits for you to find it again." The shipyard bell rang once, marking noon. Workers headed for lunch, laughing, shouting. The sound was bright, ordinary, human. Nora stood in the doorway and looked out toward the docks. The smell of salt and wood filled her lungs. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was hiding inside her life. She was in it, behind her. Grant spoke softly, almost to himself. "Good work today." She turned, the wind lifting her hair. "You too?" He smiled, brief and easy. Then he went back to the ledgers while she stood at the threshold, sunlight on her face, the sound of the bell still echoing faintly in her chest, a reminder that she was part of the rhythm now, not just listening to it. The magazine arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked neatly among the bills and grocery circulars. Grant brought the mail in with sawdust still on his sleeves, dropping the small pile onto the kitchen counter. Nora glanced at it absently while rinsing coffee cups, until the glossy cover caught her eye. Faith and Family Journal. She froze. Her name wasn't on the subscription label, but the masthead logo, gold lettering, haloed cross was unmistakable. She dried her hands on a towel, heart already thudding. Grant noticed her stillness. Something wrong. She didn't answer. Her fingers flipped the pages before her mind could stop them. Halfway through the issue, she found it a full-color spread of Pastor Eldon Ward, silver-haired, smiling beside a family in front of a white clapboard church. The headline read, "Shepherd of Second Chances, a life devoted to grace." For a moment, the kitchen disappeared. The air thinned. Every word on the page blurred except his name. His hands were folded in the photograph, the same way they had been when he'd prayed over her before the pain. Her breath came uneven. The edges of the paper trembled. Grant stepped closer, careful not to touch her. "Nora," he said softly. She blinked, lowered the magazine, and laid it flat on the counter. "They're calling him a saint." Her voice was quiet, dangerously calm. He looked down at the article paragraphs filled with praise, testimonies of families he'd helped rebuild. He recognized the pattern-polished sentences written by someone who had never looked behind closed doors. "They don't know," he said. "They don't want to know." The towel slipped from her hand and hit the floor. She stared at the smiling photograph until it stopped feeling like paper and started feeling like insult. He's still preaching, still shaking hands with parents, still holding children for photos. Grant leaned against the counter, arms folded, his own jaw tight. "You want me to take it away?" "No." Her eyes were sharp now, focused. "I want people to see what's underneath that smile." He nodded slowly. "Then we talk about how..." She sat down at the table, the magazine still open in front of her. "I don't want to go to the police," she said after a pause. "Too much time has passed. There's no proof except me." "There's more than one kind of proof," Grant said. "There's the press, the church board, your own words." She rubbed her palms together, grounding herself. "The church will protect him. They always do. The press will sensationalize it. But my words..." She hesitated. "Maybe they can help someone else see what I couldn't." Grant listened, patient, letting her thought find shape. The women's group, she said finally. Marjorie's Circle. They meet Wednesday nights. It's small, but people talk. If I speak there, the story spreads person to person. Truth travels quieter, but farther. Grant nodded once. That's your decision. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a notepad. I'll help you outline it if you want. Or I can sit in the back and listen. Her lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile. You always sit in the back. Best seat in the house, he said. The tension eased just enough for her to breathe again. She flipped the magazine shut, turning the cover face down on the table like a lid on something rotten. That night, she wrote. The kitchen light burned until midnight, pages of lined paper spreading across the table like wings. Grant worked quietly in the next room, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper against wood filling the house with calm. When she finished, she read the first line aloud, testing the weight of it. Forgiveness starts where silence ends. The sentence sat there between them, alive and dangerous. Grant leaned against the doorway, hands in his pockets. That's the truth, he said softly. It's not forgiveness for him, she added. It's forgiveness for me. For believing his prayers meant safety. He nodded. Truth has to start somewhere. She looked up, uncertain. Would you stand with me when I read it? I will, he said. Then, after a beat. Where do you want me in the back? She said. Not beside me. I need them to hear it from me alone. He smiled faintly. That's exactly where I'll be. The next morning, Nora printed the statement on cream paper, steady hands guiding each page from the old printer in the study. She folded the sheets, placed them into a manila envelope, and wrote in neat cursive Women's Circle. Wednesday. By afternoon, word of the magazine had already reached town. Marjorie stopped by with groceries and the kind of look that said she knew. You've seen it, haven't you? She asked gently. Nora nodded. I'm not staying quiet anymore. Marjorie's eyes brightened with something fierce and maternal. Then it's about time they heard a different gospel. After she left, Grant found Nora standing by the porch railing, staring out toward the sea. The wind tugged at her hair, and the magazine creased, folded, and forgotten sat in the trash can by the steps. You nervous? He asked. Yes, she admitted, but not afraid. There's a difference. He leaned beside her. You've got the truth. That's a heavy weapon when you use it right. She watched the horizon, waves breaking against the rocks. I don't want to use it like a weapon, she said quietly. I just want to take the mask off. He looked at her, the ocean light glinting off his eyes. Then take it off with grace. You'll be heard. Wednesday came sooner than either of them expected. Nora laid out her papers, each word chosen, each breath rehearsed. Grant checked the truck twice before they left, more nervous than he would admit. On the drive to the church, the town rolled past in muted colors, post office, bakery, the pier lined with lobster traps. Ordinary life moving as if no storm were coming. When they reached the church hall, she turned to him. When I'm done, she said, don't meet me right away. Let me stand there. I need to see their faces. He nodded. I'll be in the back. He watched her walk up the steps, papers clutched to her chest, the light from the door catching the edge of her hair. She paused once, looked back toward him, then went inside. Grant waited a moment longer before following, taking a seat near the door, as she had asked. At the front of the room, Nora placed the envelope on the lectern, unfolded the first page, and began to speak. Her voice was steady, every word carried like a bell across the quiet hall. From where he sat, Grant could see only her profile, outlined against the soft glow of the lights. She didn't tremble, she didn't look down. When she reached the final line, forgiveness starts where silence ends, the room held its breath. The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was reverence. Grant stayed seated, watching the back of her shoulders rise and fall with each breath. Knowing the weight she'd just laid down might never leave completely, but it no longer owned her. Outside, through the church windows, the sea wind moved through the trees, rustling like applause too quiet for anyone else to hear. The church hall smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the air thick with whispers. Folding chairs filled the space in uneven rows. A single microphone stood on a small stage beneath low-hanging lights. Nora waited at the side, her papers clutched in both hands. The sound of the room pressed around her murmurs, shuffling feet, the faint whine of the microphone as someone adjusted the cord. Grant sat in the back row, just where she had asked, his posture still, his presence a steady weight in the storm. Marjorie moved through the aisles, fussing over the chairs, giving Nora a reassuring pat on the shoulder as she passed. "You're ready, dear," she whispered. "They need to hear it." Nora nodded, though her mouth had gone dry. She could feel the tremor in her own fingers. The truth she had carried in silence for years was about to be spoken aloud. There was no undoing it. The meeting began. Routine announcements, a prayer, a few words about the upcoming charity bake sale, all ordinary, safe. Then Marjorie turned toward the microphone. "Before we close," she said, "one of our members has something she'd like to share." All eyes turned toward Nora. The sound of her shoes on the tile floor was impossibly loud. She stepped onto the small stage, unfolded the papers, and took a deep breath. "My name is Nora Bennett," she began. "Some of you know me, some only know what you've heard. A few people shifted in their seats, others looked down." She continued, voice quiet but clear. "For years, I believed silence was the same as peace. I thought if I didn't speak, the past would stay where it belonged. But silence is just another kind of cage. And I've decided I don't live there anymore." Her hands steadied as she read. Each sentence landed with deliberate calm, no tremor, no apology. She told them about trust broken under the guise of prayer, about power misused and the scars it left. She didn't give details, didn't name places. She didn't need to. The truth lived in her voice. Half the room listened, faces open, eyes glistening. The other half looked anywhere but at her. The ceiling, their folded hands, the floor. Denial has its own body language. When she reached the final line, forgiveness starts where silence ends. The microphone hummed softly. She lowered her papers, heart hammering, unsure what would come next. Then the door at the back of the hall creaked open. The sound was small, but it split the room like lightning. Eldon Ward stepped inside. He looked almost exactly as she remembered, silver hair combed neatly, suit pressed, Bible clutched in one hand. Time had made him softer around the edges, but not smaller. His voice, when it came, still had that smooth, practiced tone that once made people lean forward to listen. "Daughter," he said, smiling faintly, "let's not confuse feelings with facts." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Marjorie stiffened. Grant's shoulders straightened in the back row. Nora's breath caught, but she didn't move. She had dreamed of this moment for years, sometimes as a nightmare, sometimes as justice. But now that it was here, she felt neither. Only an unexpected calm. He took a slow step forward, his voice honeyed and full of false sorrow. "I know you're hurting. The enemy loves to use pain to twist memory. But our church has always been a house of forgiveness. Don't destroy that in front of these good people." Someone near the front murmured, "Maybe he's right." Another whispered, "Let her speak." Grant rose quietly, one deliberate motion. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He took a single step forward, only one, and stopped when Nora raised her hand without turning. She didn't need him to move closer. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "You taught me to fear God." The words hung in the air, soft but sharp as glass. Ward blinked, lips parting. "I taught you scripture." "No," she said. "You taught me fear. You used his name like armor. You said obedience was love." He took another step, his smile tightening. "Now, Nora." She didn't let him finish. "But I learned to love him without you." The room went utterly still. Even the hum of the microphone seemed to hold its breath. Gasps broke from the audience, a collective exhale of disbelief, of recognition, of something wholly breaking loose. Marjorie, standing by the wall, lifted her phone and pressed record, her hands trembling but sure. Ward's expression faltered. For the first time, his voice lost its practiced rhythm. "You don't know what you're saying," he hissed quietly. "Yes, I do." Nora's tone didn't rise, didn't waver. "I'm saying the truth doesn't need your permission anymore." He looked around the room, seeking allies, the faithful few who'd once nodded at every sermon. But the faces that met his now were uncertain. Some frowned, others turned away. Grant hadn't moved. His hands rested loosely at his sides, ready if needed, but still. The respect in his restraint was louder than any defense he could have spoken. Marjorie broke the silence. "Pastor Ward, maybe it's time someone else led the prayer tonight." A few people nodded, then more. The murmurs grew until the weight of them pushed him backward, step by reluctant step, toward the door he'd entered. He paused at the threshold, eyes narrowing at Nora. "This isn't over," he said softly. "It is for me," she replied. He left without another word. The door shut behind him, the sound final and small. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marjorie crossed the room, slipped an arm around Nora's shoulders, and whispered, "You did it, dear. You took your name back." Nora stood silent, her pulse still racing. Her gaze found Grant at the back of the hall. He didn't come forward. He only gave a slow nod, proud, reverent, steady. The microphone still hummed on the stand, forgotten. She stepped closer, switched it off, and the silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was freedom raw and ringing in her ears. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming the roof like applause. Nora gathered her papers, her hands no longer shaking. She looked at the empty doorway where he had stood, then at the circle of faces around her, witnesses, believers, some still unsure, all changed. The rain kept falling, she let it. The storm didn't stop at the church door. By morning, it had followed Nora home only now. The thunder came from glowing screens and invisible mouths. Marjorie had warned her once truth leaves the room. It travels in every direction. She hadn't been wrong. Nora sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, coffee gone cold. The article had gone live on the local news site before dawn. Former pastor confronted at women's group meeting. Someone had uploaded the recording from Marjorie's phone. By noon, there were hundreds of comments. At first, they were supportive small bursts of light. "Brave woman. Finally, someone spoke up. We believe you." Then came the darker tide. "Attention seeker. Why now? If it really happened, where's the proof?" The words blurred, black on white, until they felt like old voices she thought she'd outgrown. Grant came in from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the laptop and the look on her face, then closed the lid gently. "Don't let strangers rent space in your head," he said. "They already live there," she whispered. He rested a hand on the table, not on her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness in it. "You did right. Right doesn't always feel good," she said. "No," he admitted, "it rarely does." Later that afternoon, an email arrived from the church board, polite, official. They appreciated her courage but needed verifiable evidence before proceeding. Evidence? The word felt clinical, surgical. Proof that the wound had once been open. She closed the laptop. "They want me to show them something that hurts," she said quietly. Grant didn't answer right away. He knew the tone of a person cornered between pride and shame. "You don't owe them your pain," he said finally. "They'll say it's not real if I can't prove it. They already said that," he replied, "and you're still standing." She wanted to believe him, but by evening, the old doubts crept back. She went upstairs to the small room she used as a study, drawn by instinct more than thought. The light through the curtains fell across the old cedar chest she'd carried from one life to the next. Inside were pieces of her past letters, an embroidered handkerchief, and a wooden box that had once held a Bible her mother gave her. She hadn't opened it in years. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, beneath a yellowed bookmark, was a Polaroid photograph, one she'd forgotten existed. It was her, barely 20. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows. The faint welt at her collarbone caught the flash of the camera like a scar in moonlight. She remembered the day a church picnic, a borrowed blouse, a bruise she'd hidden too late. Someone had said, "Smile," and she had. Now she held the photo between trembling fingers. The date was printed in the white margin, July 2003. Proof. She stared at it until the air thickened. To send it would be easy attach. Click. Done. But the thought of strangers dissecting her skin, measuring her pain pixel by pixel, made her stomach turn. Grant's voice came from the doorway. "You've been quiet too long," he said softly. She didn't look up. "They want evidence?" "I know. I found some." She turned the photo toward him. He stepped closer. Stopped. His eyes darkened when he saw it. "That's not theirs to see." "It's mine," she said, "but it's the only thing that could make them believe me." He leaned against the doorframe. "Nora, if they need your body as proof, they'll never see your truth. They'll just see a story they can argue with." She sank onto the edge of the bed, the photo still in her hand. "Then what am I supposed to give them? Dates? Names? Context?" he said. "Things that build a map, not a spectacle." She looked up, tears caught at the corners of her eyes. "They'll think I'm hiding something." "Maybe you are," he said gently. "Your dignity." Silence filled the room, soft and heavy. She looked back at the photograph, then tore it cleanly in half, not in anger, but in ceremony. She placed the pieces back into the box and closed the lid. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier. "I am not a crime scene." Grant nodded, slow and solemn. "No, you're the survivor of one." They sat together at the desk as twilight bled through the windows. Nora opened a fresh notebook and began to write dates, journals, details that couldn't be erased by disbelief. August 2001, the night he locked the church after prayer service. December 2002, the sermon about obedience. March 2003, the night I ran. Grant listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes beside hers, building what he called a circle, not a wall. When she faltered, he said, "We don't have to finish tonight." "I want to," she said. "If I stop, I'll lose my courage." By the time they were done, the clock read almost midnight. In her handwriting lay a timeline, clean and spare, surrounded by the names of 3 women who had once shared the same pews. "I think they'd speak," Nora said, tapping one name. "If they knew they'd be safe." Grant's gaze softened. "Then that's where we start. Safety before spectacle." She leaned back in her chair, exhausted but lighter. "You really think anyone will listen?" He closed the notebook and tied it with a string. "They'll listen to what's steady. You don't have to scream when the truth rings clear." Downstairs, the wind moved through the open window, carrying the faint clang of the shipyard bell, the same bell that had rung the day she stitched up a man's hand, the sound of work, of purpose, of something made solid. Nora looked at the closed Bible box on her desk and the torn Polaroid inside. It wasn't proof, it was history, and she had finally stopped letting it testify for her. When Grant stood to leave, she caught his sleeve lightly. "Thank you," she said. He smiled. "You don't need me to fight your battles." "I know," she said, "but it helps to have someone standing on the same ground." He squeezed her shoulder gently and left her there in the fading light. Nora stayed a while longer, listening to the night. In the quiet, she could almost hear the echo of her own words from the church. Forgiveness starts where silence ends. Tonight, silence didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like space, the kind where new voices could begin. The chairs were mismatched, some wooden, some metal. One an old rocker pulled from the porch, but Nora arranged them carefully in a wide circle in the Whitaker house parlor. Afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes that hung like floating sparks. Grant brought in a tray of coffee and tea, setting it on the sideboard. "You sure you want to do this here?" he asked. "This house has seen silence long enough," she said. "It can hold something better now." He nodded. "Then it's ready." By 2 o'clock, the first woman arrived. She was younger than Nora expected, mid-30s. Nervous smile, a navy cardigan buttoned too tight. Her name was Emily Saunders. She had driven from 2 towns over after reading Nora's statement online. The second came a few minutes later. Patrice Lyle, 55, former choir director. Her posture straight as a hymn book, her hands trembling when she clasped Nora's. The third, Lydia Mason, was in her late 40s, tall, quiet, wearing sunglasses even indoors. She removed them only when she sat down. They didn't need to trade details. The recognition in their eyes was enough, the same pattern, different verses. Nora greeted each of them with warmth, guiding them toward the circle. "We don't have to tell everything today," she said. "We start with what feels safe." Grant stayed near the door, not as a guard, but as a presence. The house smelled of coffee and lemon polish, grounding them all in something domestic, ordinary. A few minutes later, Ellen Price arrived, 70-ish, sharp-eyed, elegant in a beige blazer. The retired judge had reached out to Nora after reading about the confrontation. "I've seen too many women fight alone." She'd written, "Let's change that." She shook Grant's hand, then addressed the room with quiet authority. "Before we speak, I'd like each of you to sign this." She laid out a stack of simple consent forms, 1 page, no fine print, your story, your control, no publication, no sharing without permission. One by one, the women signed. The sound of pens scratching on paper felt ceremonial, not bureaucracy, but ownership. When the last signature was done, Nora exhaled. The room felt different already, not heavier, but anchored. Then came the soft knock on the door. Grant opened it to reveal a man in his 40s with a notepad tucked under his arm. "Daniel Royce," he said. "Local Gazette. I reached out to Ms. Bennett about covering the meeting." Nora nodded. "You remember the rules." He lifted the notepad. No names, no faces, no details without explicit consent, just the story of the circle itself. Grant studied him for a beat, then gestured to an empty chair near the wall. "Then take notes. Not lives," he said. The man smiled slightly. "Understood." When everyone was seated, the circle felt complete. The ticking of the old mantel clock filled the pauses that followed. Ellen spoke first. "I've been in courtrooms for 40 years, she said. "You'd be amazed how many victims never make it past the courthouse steps. Shame keeps them out. So does exhaustion. This," she gestured to the room, "this is what the system should look like." Emily, the youngest, spoke next. "He wasn't a pastor," she said quietly. "He was my counselor. He said my grief made me vulnerable, and God had sent him to help. I believed him until I couldn't breathe." Patrice nodded, eyes glassy. "Mine quoted scripture, too. Said obedience was faith. I didn't stop singing in church, I just stopped believing the man behind the pulpit." Lydia took longer to speak. When she did, her voice was low and precise. "I never told anyone because I thought I'd be the only one. I didn't even give it words until now. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred." Nora clasped her hands in her lap. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "We're here because he counted on us never finding each other." The reporter scribbled quietly, head bowed, respectful. Ellen leaned forward. "I can draft affidavits if any of you choose to pursue action, but whether or not you do, this what we're building is already a kind of justice." Nora looked around the room, her gaze steady. "This isn't about destroying someone, it's about telling the truth so the next woman doesn't have to." Grant, from his corner, watched them with something like awe. The strength in the room wasn't loud. It was layered, cumulative, the sound of walls rebuilt from within. The conversation stretched through the afternoon, moments of tears, laughter, long silences. Someone refilled the coffee. Marjorie dropped by with a plate of sandwiches and stayed to listen, her eyes bright. At one point, Daniel the reporter closed his notebook and just sat, the pencil still behind his ear. His expression had changed, the professional distance replaced by something more personal. When the others paused, he cleared his throat. "If I may," he said quietly, "what you've built here, I wish my sister had it." The words landed softly, but their weight filled the room. Ellen's gaze softened. Was she? He nodded once, eyes down. She didn't have a circle, just a wall. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Patrice reached across the circle and laid a hand on his arm. "You can sit here as long as you need," she said. The clock ticked once, twice. Outside, the light began to fade, the first streaks of evening gold slipping through the windows. Grant stepped forward quietly and lit the small lamp on the side table. Its glow washed across their faces, warm and steady. Ellen gathered the signed forms into a folder and closed it with care. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning of a record. When you speak together, the law listens differently." Nora looked around the circle at Emily's nervous strength, Patrice's fierce composure, Lydia's fragile courage, Ellen's dignity, Daniel's quiet grief. Her throat tightened. "Then let's keep it going," she said. "Every week, here, if you'll come." There was a murmur of agreement. Even Daniel nodded. Grant brought out more chairs, just in case. As they stood to leave, the women hugged each other, brief, cautious, but real, a promise in every embrace. When the door closed behind the last one, Nora turned to Grant. "It feels different now," she said softly. "It should," he replied. "You just turned a house into a refuge." She looked at the empty circle of chairs. "Maybe that's all I ever wanted, a place where truth could sit down and stay." Grant smiled, small and proud. "Then you've built it." Outside, the porch light flickered on. The sea wind carried the faint clang of the shipyard bell, echoing against the walls. But inside, the sound of quiet voices lingered, women promising to return, to keep speaking, to stay seen. For the first time, silence no longer meant alone, it meant peace. The first snow of winter came quietly, slipping through the gray sky like forgiveness, soft, reluctant, melting on contact. Nora watched it fall from the kitchen window, her fingers curled around a mug of tea gone lukewarm. The radio murmured low in the background, a local station reading headlines. She barely listened until she heard his name. Reverend Eldon Ward has announced his resignation, citing health reasons. The church conference confirms a formal inquiry will follow. The mug stopped halfway to her lips. Grant came in from the porch, shaking snow off his shoulders. "You heard he asked." She nodded, setting the mug down carefully. "Health reasons," she said softly. "That's how they do it. Let the wolves leave through the front gate." Grant leaned against the counter, watching her. "The inquiry's real," he said. "Ellen confirmed it this morning. They're digging into old files." She turned to the window again. "It's not about him anymore," she said. "It's about everyone who still sits in those pews, wondering if they imagined it." Outside, the snow thickened, clinging to the fence posts, the gate, the sign that still read Whitaker House. By noon, the story had broken in the Gazette. Daniel's article, simple and restrained. 3 women step forward. Former pastor resigns amid allegations. No names, no faces, just the truth, clean and sharp, and then came the town. Half of them came bearing casseroles, loaves of bread, handwritten notes slipped under the door. The other half crossed the street when they saw her coming, eyes darting anywhere but her face. Marjorie said it best over coffee one morning. "You didn't divide this town, dear. You just showed where the crack already was." The shipyard, meanwhile, moved differently. The men had seen enough to know who deserved respect. When Grant told them Nora wanted to start a counseling fund for women leaving abusive homes, they didn't hesitate. They passed a coffee can at lunch breaks, added overtime pay, brought spare cash folded small and anonymous. By the end of the week, the can held over $25,000. Grant brought the envelope home one evening and placed it on the kitchen table. "For your program," he said simply. Nora stared at it, tears rising unbidden. "I don't even know what to call it." "Call it what it is," he said. "A beginning." So she did. She drafted the paperwork that night, Ellen guiding her through the language the Harbor Fund, providing confidential counseling and housing for survivors of spiritual abuse. It felt right, the name, the purpose, a place where people could land after the storm. But for every kindness, there was still the chill of doubt. Some nights she caught whispers at the market, saw familiar faces turn away. The church bulletin stopped arriving in her mailbox. She thought she'd stopped caring until she saw one headline printed in bold above Ward's photograph: "Faith restored through forgiveness." Forgiveness again. Always that word, turned like a key in every lock that had ever held her. She shut the paper, folded it neatly, and threw it in the wood stove. The flames took it greedily. "I'm not angry," she told Grant that night. "I didn't say you were," he replied. "I just wish forgiveness didn't always mean forgetting." He nodded. "You don't owe anyone amnesia." The inquiry continued quietly. People whispered, the world moved, and winter deepened. One gray morning, after a week of snow and silence, Nora walked the path to the gate to check the mail. The air smelled of salt and frost. A small envelope sat propped against the post, sealed with blue wax. She frowned, glanced down the empty road, then opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of stationery, handwritten in an elegant, wavering script. "Thank you for telling the truth. I couldn't." There was no signature, but she knew the handwriting. She had seen it on church letters, meal rosters, cards tucked into hymnals. Ward's wife. Nora stood there a long time, the note trembling in her hands. The snow fell around her, slow and steady, each flake melting on the paper. She didn't weep for him, not even for what he'd done. She wept for the girl she'd been, the one who thought silence was survival, who folded her sleeves to hide the truth and prayed no one would look too close. The tears came quietly, a release more than a wound. When Grant found her, she was still by the gate, the letter folded small in her gloved palm. He didn't ask what it said. He just took her free hand and held it until the shaking stopped. They walked back toward the house together. The path was covered now, footprints already softening under new snow. At the porch, Nora turned back once, her breath rising in the cold air. "She's still there," she said, "in that house, alone." "She's not the only one," Grant said gently, but she found her voice, even if it came late. Nora nodded. Maybe that's enough. They went inside, where the fire waited, bright and steady. The warmth reached them slowly, seeping through their coats, through the ache of the day. Later that afternoon, she pinned the letter to the corkboard above her desk, beside the notes for the Harbor Fund and the list of women who had joined the circle. Each line, each name, each scrap of truth formed a map of survival, not just hers, but theirs. When she sat down to write her next speech for the women's group, she started with one line: "The world will always ask for proof, but what saves us is witness." Outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds parted just enough for a strip of light to break through, pale gold against the white fields. Nora watched it until it faded, her hand resting on the letter. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hunted by memory. She felt held by it, like the ocean holding the shore after the tide has gone out. The first frogs of spring had started their song. It was a sound Nora hadn't realized she'd missed, that chorus of soft, overlapping voices from the marsh beyond the dunes, rising and falling like breath. The air carried the scent of thawed earth and cedar. After months of snow and silence, the world seemed to exhale. The circle at Whitaker House had grown. New women came each week, some with stories too raw for words, others with laughter just beginning to return. The Harbor Fund was officially registered now. The first counseling sessions were underway. Life had become something steady, purposeful, but not loud. And yet, in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the lamps burned low, she sometimes caught herself thinking of the sound of 3 soft knocks. It was how Grant had always come to her door, never pushing, never entering without invitation. 3 gentle taps, like a heartbeat against the wood. That night, she found herself walking down the path toward his workshop. The air was cool, touched with salt from the ocean. Through the open window, she saw him bent over a table, planing a strip of oak, sawdust dusting his forearms like pale gold. She paused at the threshold. Her hand rose before she could think 1, 2, 3 quiet knocks. He looked up immediately, eyes finding hers through the dim light. "Nora," he said, setting the plane aside. "Did I forget the meeting tonight?" She shook her head. "No meeting." Her voice was soft, deliberate. "I just wanted to talk." He wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward the stool by the workbench. "Then talk," he said, gentle as ever. But she didn't sit. She stepped closer, her shoes whispering against the wood floor. "Do you remember the night we first came here?" She asked. "You left the door open. Said nothing would happen unless I asked." Grant nodded slowly. "I remember." Her breath trembled. "You've kept that promise." He tilted his head. "That's the only way it works." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "It's strange. The world finally stopped asking me for proof, and now I want to ask for something instead." "Ask," he said. The silence stretched, tender and fragile. The frogs sang louder outside, the rhythm of their voices filling the space between them. She took another step forward until they were only a few feet apart. "If I ask," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "will you hold me?" Grant didn't move. Not yet. His eyes searched hers. "Patient, steady, always," he said quietly. "And only as you ask." Something in her broke open, not like glass, but like ice giving way to water. She nodded once. He didn't reach for her. He waited. Her hands moved first small, certain reaching for his. She placed them gently against her shoulders, her breath catching when his fingers brushed the edge of her collar. Beneath the fabric, the faintest shadow of a scar lay across her skin. Pale now, almost gone. He saw it, but didn't trace it. His touch was reverent, the kind that honors rather than claims. Her eyes closed. "There," she whispered. "That's enough." He nodded, his thumbs resting still against the curve of her shoulders, the warmth of his palms steady and human. Neither spoke. The silence held them, filled not with tension, but release. Outside, the peepers sang louder, the night alive with their fragile joy. Grant's voice came soft, almost prayerful. "Do you know what this means to me?" She opened her eyes. "Tell me, that you trust me more than the world ever deserved to." Her lips curved faintly. "You earned it, inch by inch." He smiled then, not the polite kind he gave at the shipyard, but the unguarded one, small and raw. "That's the best kind of work," he said. She leaned her forehead against his chest. The scent of cedar and soap filled her lungs. He didn't tighten his arms, didn't move closer. He simply let her exist there, weight and warmth and peace. Time slowed. The workshop light flickered softly, catching the grain of the wood, the dust in the air, the faint shimmer of tears drying on her lashes. When she finally stepped back, she kept one of his hands in hers. "I used to think love meant surrender," she said. "Now I think it means choice." Grant's gaze was steady. "Then choose when you need to." "I'll be here either way." She smiled through the tears that refused to fall. "You always say the right thing. That's because I wait until you say yours first," he replied. They both laughed quiet, shared, like old friends remembering how to breathe. She turned toward the window. Then, beyond it, the ocean shimmered under the moonlight, restless but forgiving. "I never thought I'd feel safe near water again," she said softly. Grant followed her gaze. "Water remembers every tide, he said, "but it keeps coming back. That's what survival looks like." She looked at him, eyes shining in the low light. "So does love." He reached up then, brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the gesture simple, almost domestic. Then he stepped back, giving her space to leave, to decide. Nora lingered in the doorway, one hand on the frame. "I might ask again someday," she said. "I'll be listening," he replied. She nodded, the smallest bow of gratitude, and slipped out into the night. The frogs still sang, the air smelled of cedar, salt, and something new, like earth after rain. From the window, the light of the workshop cast a soft glow over the yard, spilling toward the dunes and the dark stretch of ocean beyond. Inside, Grant turned off the lamp, leaving the door unlatched. Outside, Nora paused halfway down the path, the sea wind lifting her hair. She touched her shoulder, the place where his hands had rested, and felt not the echo of pain, but the warmth of something holy, something earned. The night held its breath, the tide turned, the summer light had changed everything. It poured across the harbor in gold ribbons, turning even the old boathouse into something gentle, almost new. A year had passed since the inquiry, since Nora's name stopped being a whisper and became something steadier, something like a beacon. The Harbor Fund had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. Ellen's legal guidance, Daniel's coverage, and the quiet generosity of townspeople had transformed the idea into a real place. The harbor room, carved out of an old boathouse near the edge of the pier. Today was the opening. Grant had been up since dawn, hanging canvas banners while Marjorie arranged flowers in chipped glass vases. The smell of seagrass and lemon oil filled the air. The windows gleamed, their frames newly painted white. Inside, sunlight touched every corner, therapy chairs, bookshelves, a small kitchenette with mugs donated from half the town. At the entrance, a brass plaque caught the light. Nora ran her fingers over the engraved words, reading them softly under her breath, for the ones who found their voices. Grant came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. Straight enough, she smiled. "It's perfect." He nodded toward the rafters. Ready for the last piece from the back of his truck, he lifted a bundle wrapped in linen. When he pulled the cloth away, the sound of small ship bells shimmered in the air, each one polished, each tone slightly different. Wind chimes, made from the bells of retired fishing boats. He handed them to her. "I thought they should still have a job," he said. Together, they hung the chimes above the doorway. The breeze from the harbor caught them immediately, their music soft but sure, a sound both of memory and of beginning. People began to arrive, women from the circle, shipyard workers, a few church members who'd learned to listen rather than judge. The mayor gave a brief speech. Ellen spoke next, her voice strong and proud. "This isn't just a building," she said. "It's proof that truth builds better foundations than fear ever did." Applause rippled through the crowd. Nora stayed near the back, hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She hadn't wanted to speak, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The room itself was her testimony. Still, when the applause faded, someone called out, "Say a few words." "Nora." The murmurs grew until she couldn't refuse. Grant gave her an encouraging nod. She stepped forward, sunlight touching her shoulders. "I used to think the hardest thing in life was surviving," she said quietly. "But surviving is only half the story. The other half is what you build afterward with your own hands, your own heart. This place isn't mine alone. It's ours. It belongs to every person who ever thought silence was safety. It's proof that we can rebuild what fear tried to take." The wind carried her words across the pier, mingling with the sound of the chimes. Applause rose again, warm and full, but amid the clapping, she heard a voice near the back, a man's voice. Low, sharp. "She should have kept quiet," he muttered. The air stilled. A few heads turned. Before Nora could answer, Marjorie stepped forward from the crowd, her chin lifted. "She kept quiet for years," she said, voice clear as glass. "That nearly killed her. You're welcome to prefer the silence, sir, but The rest of us are done living inside it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a woman near the front began to clap, slow, deliberate. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the sound swelled again, stronger this time, echoing off the water and the dock. The man lowered his head and walked away. Nora caught Marjorie's eye. The older woman winked. The ceremony ended with laughter, hugs, and the clink of coffee cups against paper plates. The bells above the door kept singing in the breeze, each note a small reminder of endurance. By late afternoon, the crowd began to thin. Nora helped tidy the tables, her bare feet cool against the wood floor. The air smelled of salt and lilac. Outside, the sea glittered beneath a wide, forgiving sky. Grant found her by the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've done it," he said quietly. "We've done it," she corrected. He chuckled. "You always fix my grammar." She smiled, resting her elbows on the railing. The tide lapped against the pilings below. Children ran down the pier, their laughter blending with gull cries and the distant clang of the shipyard bell. For a while, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the water. When the sky began to turn gold, she spoke again. "I used to think healing meant erasing everything," she said, "but I can still feel it sometimes. The old fear, like a shadow that's learned better manners." "That's all healing is," Grant said, "teaching the shadows where to stand." She looked at him then, the warmth in his eyes mirroring the light on the waves. "You make it sound easy." He smiled. "No, just worth it." As the sun dipped lower, the guests drifted away. Marjorie waved from her car. Ellen hugged them both before leaving for town. The last to go were the women from the circle, Emily, Patrice, Lydia, their faces glowing with the quiet pride of people who'd come through fire and found each other on the other side. When the pier finally emptied, only the sea remained vast, calm, endless. Nora leaned her head against Grant's shoulder. The sound of the chimes played softly behind them, weaving with the sigh of the tide. "I'm not afraid of nights anymore," she said. He looked out at the water. "Then, let's fill them with light." She smiled, eyes closing, the warmth of the sun still clinging to her skin. The chimes sang again, low, clear, certain, and for the first time, she didn't hear them as warning bells, but as music. The harbor breathed, the waves whispered against the shore. The day slipped into evening, gentle and whole. Peace didn't arrive like a shout. It came quietly, on a summer wind, and stayed. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, not in grand apologies or perfect justice, but in the quiet moment someone chooses to listen without reaching. Nora's story reminds us that love is not about fixing what's broken, but about holding space for what survived. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it lets the heart breathe beside it, and strength, it rarely looks like shouting. Most days, it sounds like steady hands, honest words, and the courage to say, "This is my truth, and I'm still here." Maybe that's what grace really is. Not a sermon, not a miracle, but a life rebuilt out of gentleness. One step, one voice, one shared silence at a time. And in the end, when the tide returns and the night feels long, it's enough to know this. We are not defined by what hurt us, but by how we choose to love after. Thank you for being here with us, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that remind the world of its gentleness, of the quiet courage still living in ordinary lives. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a little light tonight. Because healing grows when it's shared, and kindness, once spoken, never truly fades. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for helping us keep that light alive.